I just want to firstly register that the non-vote on the Coronavirus Act in the other House last week, with a seemingly glib statement that the House was not in the mood to vote, was unsettling. Although, in fact, a majority of the most illiberal and worrying uses and abuses of the law over the last 18 months have been acted through public health legislation, nonetheless, the Coronavirus Act remains as a legislative symbol of the state accruing enormous and unprecedented powers to deal with the public health emergency. To be clear, of course, when the Act was brought in, there was an emergency, and whatever about my own reservations or those with fellow civil libertarians, we could see that a worldwide pandemic gave an excuse to the government having to act quickly and to respond in the way it did and explain some of the extreme measures. But that really was then, and whatever possible excuses there were for little parliamentary scrutiny when the Act was initially passed, since then, post-legislative scrutiny, the lack of post-legislative scrutiny and accountability being so woeful, really there's no excuse for. But let me just say this. The urgency of the initial stages of the pandemic have passed. There is no longer a public health emergency. Of course, COVID is still a serious challenge and needs to be managed carefully. I don't underestimate it. A family member sadly died of COVID only recently. However, the crisis stage of the pandemic has passed, and this legislation is just not needed. Its continued existence and the government's reluctance to revoke it represents another kind of crisis, that there is the undermining of the rule of law and democratic decision-making under the auspices of COVID. And it really does feel as though the ministers have grown rather too accustomed to the COVID-related ease with which laws can be made when the government has enhanced legislative control and seem reluctant to relinquish newly accrued powers. To quote Big Brother Watch, quote, "The emergency mode and its perks, rapid lawmaking without scrutiny and a ratcheting of executive powers has persisted." Perhaps most galling for me is that the government seem reluctant to provide impact assessment statements for legislation, which means that Parliament has often not had the necessary information it needs to properly scrutinise measures which have profound social, economic and health impacts, let alone assaults on our liberties. And this lack of transparency also blindsides public debate. Too often citizens are left to speculate as to why certain laws are being introduced when there seems so little evidence of their efficacy. And undoubtedly this has fuelled conspiracy mongering and undermines trust in politics and institutions. Look at the egregious way that proposals to mandate vaccines for care home workers was dealt with. A rushed 90-minute debate in the other place, a cavalier use of secondary legislation to interfere in workers' hard-won employment rights, that's likely to create a huge staff shortage crisis in care homes, and all in the face of a wide range of opponents pointing out the shortcomings of the proposals. And I'm thinking here of everyone from trade unions to Tory backbench members, MPs agreeing, and that in spite of a lack of evidence that this policy will lead to any extra protection for vulnerable residents as alleged. Now the government are doubling down and targeting NHS staff. Just when we're told that one reason why the government might bring in further restrictions if necessary is if the NHS can't cope this winter, the Department of Health and Social Care has the brilliant idea of implementing a policy that will mean effectively sacking thousands of frontline health workers, creating a staff shortage crisis that could have, guess what, catastrophic implications for healthcare and make matters worse. Ministers keep threatening the public with really quite draconian measures again. And it's totally demoralising and disorientating. What we really need to hear from the Minister today is that the government will no longer use the criminal law to manage public health. But instead, what we have is another attack on freedoms hanging over us in the form of vaccine passports. Despite a range of U-turns and contradictory ministerial public pronouncements on vaccine passes, despite the findings of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee that COVID passes have, quote, no basis in science or logic, despite leaked but not publicly available cost-benefit analysis from the DCMS that passes will decimate so much of the hospitality, arts and sports event venues, which I read about in the newspaper rather than anything produced by ministers, despite the fact that the Prime Minister inadvertently admitted that immunity from vaccination is not the same as a guarantee that you can't contract the virus or pass it on, hence rendering vaccine passes as irrelevant in containing the social spread of the virus, as well explained by Lord Scriven, despite the fact that the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine Vaccine Confidence Project has found that the introduction of vaccine passports will most likely reduce vaccine take-up amongst the already hesitant and will more likely consolidate a loss of trust in pharmacological interventions in general, as well as in political institutions. Despite all this, we still hear the misinformation from the government that vaccine passports as a policy will protect others. They just won't. And where is the opportunity for Parliament, never mind the public, to debate all of this fully without fear of being demonised or silenced by big tech, to discuss fully the implications of an illiberal, divisive, show your papers culture? So as we talk about the renewal of the Emergency Coronavirus Act, the Emergency Temporary Coronavirus Act, allegedly, here today, my dread is that we are signalling the permanence of a state of emergency embedded in the law by even contemplating a two-tiered checkpoint society. The truth is, all health ministers really need to move away from vaccine passes because you've got enough on your plates. And rather than get embroiled in these politicised rows over COVID-related laws, surely it's time to move on. Goodness knows you now have some real public health emergencies and emergencies to sort out. And in this context, the now diminishing threat of COVID as an emergency should be low down the priority list, and all legal sanctions brought into being to deal with it now need to be revoked for the sake of the health of the body politic and so that you can get on being a health minister for non-COVID health emergencies.